There are geniuses born not in glowing libraries or among polished marble halls, but in the shadows of rented rooms where a child clutches a pencil as his only weapon against fate. Winter in Cambridge was cruel. Snow blanketed the old stones of Harvard Yard, and lamps cast their faint yellow glow across the quiet squares. In those hours when the students were gone, a man pushed a cart filled with mops and rags down long hallways. His name was Miguel. He bent his shoulders low, hands cracked from years of cleaning, and yet he moved with a patience that came from pride. Harvard was not his school, nor his world, but to him it was sacred ground. In his heart, one prayer repeated itself. Perhaps his son might one day walk here not as the janitor's child, but as a student. The boy was 10 years old, thin as a reed, with restless dark hair and eyes that carried more fire than fear. Samuel lived with his father in a cramped room in Somerville, its paint peeling, its windows fogged with frost. They could not afford much heat. At night, while Miguel slept, Samuel bent over a wooden chair, scribbling numbers by the dim light of a lamp. He had no computer, no chalkboard, no luxury of tools, only scraps of paper salvaged from the classrooms his father cleaned. Old lecture notes, a discarded textbook, half-crumpled problem sheets. To others, these were trash. To Samuel, they were treasure. One evening, as wind howled beyond the walls, Miguel placed a rough hand on the boy's shoulder. "Samuel, do not suffer yourself over numbers. The world is already hard enough." The boy looked up and smiled with the honesty of childhood. "But, Papa, they are beautiful." That night, snow thickened over Cambridge. Miguel brought his son along to Harvard, for the cold in their room was unbearable. As Miguel pushed his cart through the mathematics building, Samuel slipped into an empty lecture hall. The door was ajar. Inside, silence reigned. On the blackboard remained the chalk marks of a challenge left unsolved, a problem drawn from the International Mathematical Olympiad, a question that had mocked the brightest students in the class. Samuel stood before it, reading the symbols with a kind of wonder. He was not intimidated by what he did not know. He saw not a wall, but a doorway. His small hand trembled as he reached for a piece of chalk. Letters appeared, uneven and slanted, the handwriting of a child. But behind the awkward shapes lived clarity of thought. Instead of chasing endless numbers, Samuel turned the puzzle on its head, looking for patterns others had ignored. His approach was incomplete, but in its roughness lay brilliance. When he finished, he stepped back, breathing out as if relieved of a burden. A 10-year-old boy, the janitor's child, had written across Harvard's board, though no one yet knew. Morning came. The first to enter was Ethan, a junior famous on campus as a former Olympiad medalist, the kind of student people called a prodigy. He was used to praise, used to the weight of being the best. He walked into the lecture hall, ready to continue where he had left off, but when his eyes met the blackboard, he froze. The handwriting was foreign, almost childish, but the ideas leapt from the board with unsettling force. Ethan read slowly, pulse quickening. The unknown hand had struck exactly at the blind spot that had trapped him and his classmates. While they had tried brute force, the writer had searched for hidden structure, for rhythm inside the numbers. It was naive in form, but fearless in vision. He whispered to himself, Who could have done this?" Hours later, the classroom filled with students. The professor entered, tall, severe, accustomed to order. He prepared to wipe the strange chalk marks away when Ethan stood up. His voice shook. "Sir, please, leave it. There's something here." Whispers rippled through the room. Miguel entered to clean, Samuel trailing behind him, eyes lowered as if to disappear. Ethan turned, his gaze sharp, and studied the boy. He pointed to the blackboard. Was it you? He asked softly. Samuel froze. His lips parted, but no sound came. Miguel hurried forward, bowing his head. Forgive him. He was curious, nothing more. He should not have touched your board. I will clean it at once. But Ethan raised a hand. His voice broke with something that sounded like awe. No, do not erase this. None of us here thought that way. None of us saw what he saw. The room fell silent. Students who had laughed at janitors and forgotten children now looked at the boy differently. The professor himself stood wordless, caught between pride and humility. Samuel whispered, barely audible, I only wanted to help my father. If I can be good at math, maybe one day he will not have to sweep these halls anymore. Miguel's arms wrapped around his son. His hands, hardened by years of labor, trembled. He had never dared to imagine this, that his child, his little boy in worn shoes and patched sweaters, could leave a mark upon the same walls where the world's brightest minds gathered. The Olympiad problem would not be fully solved that day. In truth, such questions often remain open for decades, even centuries. But what mattered was not the final solution. It was the spark. A new way of seeing had entered the room, carried not by a polished scholar, but by a boy who saw beauty in numbers the way other children saw stars. And from that moment, for those who witnessed it, Harvard was no longer just a fortress of the privileged. It was also a place where the son of a janitor could lift his chalk and remind them all what genius truly meant. As snow fell again that night, Miguel walked home with Samuel by his side. The cold air pressed against them, but the man no longer shivered. Somewhere deep inside, he carried a warmth that no winter could steal. The warmth of knowing his son's fire would burn brighter than any hardship. The child of silent hallways had spoken, and the world had listened. The days after that quiet revelation passed with a strangeness that neither Miguel nor Samuel could fully grasp. In the janitor's small apartment, life remained the same. Mornings began with the whistle of the kettle, bread bought from yesterday's discount bin, a rush to keep warm before the chill crept back into the walls. Yet something invisible had changed. Miguel noticed it in the way his son's eyes lingered on the world, as though Samuel had touched something vast and was still listening to its echo. At Harvard, word began to spread in hushed tones. Students whispered of an unknown hand that had left a trail of brilliance across a blackboard. Some dismissed it as rumor. Others swore they had seen the uneven script themselves. Ethan, usually proud, remained uncharacteristically quiet. Each time he passed Miguel and the boy in the hallway, he lowered his gaze, not out of shame, but out of respect he could not yet voice. One evening, as Miguel scrubbed the marble floor of the mathematics building, Samuel sat against the wall, knees pulled to his chest. His father's hands worked with the rhythm of long habit, sweeping water across stone, but his heart was restless. At last he spoke. "Samuel," he said, without looking up, "I don't want you to come inside these classrooms anymore. People may think you do not belong." The boy's reply was soft, almost afraid. "But Papa, when I see the blackboards, it feels like hearing music. I cannot stop myself." Miguel wrung the mop and sighed. He had scrubbed away years of other people's brilliance, watching formulas vanish into the bucket as though they were never written. But his son's words pierced him. He set the mop aside, lowered himself to the floor beside Samuel, and whispered, "If you hear music, my son, then perhaps the world will one day have to listen to your song." That same week, Professor Adler, the man who had almost erased Samuel's writing, found himself unable to shake the memory of those chalk lines. He was a stern man, bald at the crown, with a reputation for dismissing mediocrity. Yet as he stood in his office late at night, poring over proofs, he felt an unfamiliar unease. The child's raw idea had touched something in him. It was not polished, but it was alive. And for a scholar buried in the perfection of journals and conferences, that aliveness was rare. Adler decided to test the rumor. The next evening, while Miguel polished brass railings, the professor entered the hall quietly. He set a simple problem on the board, not Olympiad level, but one requiring a subtle trick of thought. Then he waited. Miguel, seeing the professor, nearly dropped his rag. He bowed low, muttering apologies, but Adler raised a hand. "Continue your work. Pay me no mind." Samuel, uncertain, lingered at the doorway. The chalk marks on the board glowed under the yellow light. The professor, without turning, said gently, "If you wish, child, you may try." Samuel froze. Miguel's breath caught. For a moment, the boy seemed smaller than ever, a fragile figure in patched clothing. But then, step by cautious step, he approached. He picked up a piece of chalk as if it weighed 100 pounds. Minutes passed. The boy frowned, rubbed his sleeve against the board, drew and redrew. His writing was crooked, sometimes misspelled, but the reasoning was sound. At last he stopped, stepping back. The solution lay before them, rough yet complete. Adler studied the board. His face betrayed no expression, yet inside he felt the ground shift. He had tested the boy with a puzzle that defeated many first-year students, and here it was unraveled by a child with no textbooks, no guidance, only instinct. Miguel waited for rebuke, for laughter, for dismissal. Instead, Adler spoke, voice low. "How old are you?" 10, Samuel answered, his voice nearly a whisper. The professor turned, eyes narrowing as if to pierce through years of silence. 10, he repeated. Then, after a long pause, he said words Miguel would never forget. "Then we are standing before a miracle." That night, Miguel carried his son home through the snow, the words still ringing in his ears. A miracle. He wanted to believe it, but belief was dangerous for men who had spent their lives cleaning after others. Yet as Samuel slept against his shoulder, he allowed himself one secret tear of hope. The following days brought new tension. Some students welcomed the boy, curious about the janitor's son who could bend numbers to his will. Others sneered, muttering that it was a trick, that no child could touch their world. Ethan, torn between pride and humility, finally approached Samuel in the hallway. He knelt so their eyes were level. "Your handwriting," Ethan said softly, "is not as neat as mine. But your mind, I have never seen anything like it. Do you know what it means to solve problems no one else can?" Samuel shook his head. "I only know it makes my heart quiet." Ethan smiled sadly. "Then never let anyone take that quiet from you." But the greatest test came one Friday evening. Adler invited Miguel and Samuel into his office. Books towered on every shelf. Papers lay in unruly stacks. On the desk rested a sheet with a problem of legendary fame, whispered among mathematicians for decades. It was not one the professor expected the boy to solve, only to see how his mind danced with impossibility. Samuel studied it, lips moving silently. His fingers traced the air as though conducting invisible music. He began to write. Not a solution, not yet, but a map. New paths, strange perspectives, glimmers of an approach even Adler himself had never considered. When the chalk finally slipped from his hand, the professor leaned back, eyes closed. For the first time in years, Adler felt young again, as though standing at the edge of discovery. He looked at Miguel. "This boy will either burn out in sorrow or light the world on fire. It is up to us which it will be." On their way home, Miguel walked more slowly than usual. Snow fell gently, coating their path. Samuel's small hand rested in his. The janitor's heart was heavy with fear, for he knew the world was cruel to those who did not belong. Yet beneath the fear was something he dared not name. Faith. Faith that the music his son heard in the silence of numbers might one day be heard by all. And so the whisper of chalk dust lingered in their lives. It carried with it the promise of pain, the certainty of struggle, but also the fragile glow of destiny. The child of silent hallways had been noticed. The question was no longer whether he was a genius. The question was how long the world would allow him to remain unseen. Harvard's lecture halls had always belonged to the privileged, to those whose families carried names inscribed on library walls or whose bloodlines had walked the campus for generations. Yet now, on certain evenings, a boy in patched shoes stood before the blackboard, leaving trails of chalk that even graduate students paused to study. For some, it was a marvel. For others, it was an offense. Professor Adler had begun inviting Samuel quietly, under the guise of helping his father. He would wait until the halls grew quiet, then slip the boy inside and watch his small hands work. The professor tried to teach with caution, afraid to crush the child's untamed brilliance with the heavy weight of theory. He offered gentle nudges, showing Samuel the idea of modular arithmetic, the way numbers repeat in cycles, or the trick of looking for symmetry in an equation. Samuel absorbed it all with a hunger that startled even Adler. He did not simply learn, he transformed. But whispers grew louder. Some faculty scoffed at the notion that a janitor's son could glimpse truths their best students struggled to approach. They called it childish curiosity, a fluke, a momentary accident. Among them was Professor Klein, a rigid man who measured worth by pedigree and citation counts. He sneered whenever Adler's name arose in the common room. "Harvard is not an orphanage," Klein said one afternoon, his voice dripping with disdain. "If Adler wishes to entertain street children, he should do it in his home, not in our lecture halls." Ethan overheard and clenched his fists, but he was only a student. His protest would mean little. He carried the weight in silence, yet in his heart he vowed to stand by Samuel if ever the boy was humiliated. Miguel sensed the danger as well. Each night, as they walked home through the snow, he wrestled with fear. "Samuel," he murmured, "you must remember, these people do not know you as I do. If they turn against you, it will hurt more than anything." The boy looked up, his breath clouding in the cold. "But Papa, isn't the truth worth the hurt?" Miguel had no answer. He only tightened his grip on his son's hand. The trial came sooner than either of them expected. On a gray afternoon, Adler invited Samuel to sit quietly at the back of a graduate seminar. It was meant to be harmless, an hour to listen, nothing more. But Samuel, restless with ideas, began sketching on a scrap of paper. The topic was number theory, the distribution of prime numbers, a subject far beyond any child's reach. Yet Samuel's notes spilled across the page with daring leaps, drawing strange diagrams, circles connecting primes, imagining them like constellations rather than mere integers. A student noticed, leaned over, and whispered mockingly, "What are you scribbling, janitor's kid?" Others chuckled. Samuel shrank into his chair, but Adler caught sight of the paper as the class ended. He picked it up, studied the messy constellations, and felt his chest tighten. The boy had stumbled, unknowingly, into an uncharted approach, linking prime patterns with geometry. Crude, unfinished, but pulsing with originality. Adler's eyes lifted, only to meet Klein at the door. The rival professor had been watching. He snatched the paper from Adler's hands and sneered loud enough for all to hear. "This is nonsense! Circles and stars? This is what happens when we let children play at scholarship. It is an insult to the discipline." Laughter echoed. Samuel's cheeks burned crimson. He tried to hide behind his father's worn coat, but the sting had already pierced him. Miguel glared, his body tense, but he dared not raise his voice in a place where he was invisible. That night, silence filled their small room. Samuel sat by the window, refusing bread, his hands clenched. Miguel wanted to tell him it did not matter, that tomorrow the world would forget. But the boy whispered instead, "Papa, maybe I don't belong after all." Miguel knelt beside him, heart breaking. "Listen to me, Samuel. You belong wherever truth is. Do not let men who fear you decide your worth." His voice cracked, but his grip was steady. Days passed, and Samuel grew quieter. He still studied, still wrote, but the sparkle dimmed. Adler noticed and resolved to act. One evening he carried the boy and his father into a hidden room of the library, a place few knew existed. Inside, towering shelves held the private archives of past geniuses, notes of Ramanujan, letters of Hardy, manuscripts stained with time. Adler placed one brittle notebook before Samuel. "These pages," Adler said softly, "were once dismissed as the ramblings of an untrained man from India. They laughed at him, too, but inside were formulas that changed mathematics forever. His name was Ramanujan." Samuel touched the faded ink, his small fingers trembling. "They thought he was nothing?" Adler nodded. "Yes, until the world could no longer deny him. Do you understand? Greatness does not ask permission." Something lit in Samuel's eyes again. The fire flickered, fragile but alive. He looked at his father, then at the notebook, and whispered, "Then I will not stop." Miguel, tears unbidden, bent his head. He had lived a life of doors closed and dreams denied. But for the first time, he believed his son might push those doors open, not only for himself, but for every child born in silence. Yet even as faith returned, shadows lengthened. Klein was not finished. He carried envy like a blade, and he would use it. In the weeks to come, he would press harder, stirring doubt, seeking to silence the miracle before it grew too bright. But for now, in the secret room of the library, amid dust and forgotten manuscripts, a boy 10 years old lifted his chin once more. He saw himself in Ramanujan's faded pages, and though the world laughed, his heart whispered the same vow: the truth is worth the hurt. And so the child of silent hallways prepared to walk deeper into the storm. Winter yielded slowly in Cambridge, but the snow on Harvard's steps lingered like stubborn memories. For Samuel, each day now carried two weights: the pull of numbers, which sang to him in every quiet corner, and the sting of ridicule, which returned like an echo whenever he picked up chalk. He had grown taller by inches, but inside he still carried the tender heart of a child who longed only to see beauty in what others feared. Professor Adler tried to shield him. He invited Samuel during hours when the halls were quiet, offered him simple puzzles dressed as games, and praised him softly so as not to frighten away the spark. Yet whispers continued to coil through the faculty lounges. Some spoke of genius in rags, others of nonsense chalkings. Klein's voice was the loudest among the doubters. One March evening, Klein staged his challenge. He cornered Adler in a faculty meeting, his tone dripping with scorn. "If this janitor's child is truly what you claim, let him show it in daylight, not in shadows. Let him solve a problem before witnesses, a problem worthy of Harvard, not childish riddles." Adler bristled. He knew the cruelty behind such a trap. A public stage could crush the fragile courage of a 10-year-old. Yet he also understood that silence would allow Klein to bury the boy's promise forever. And so, with a heart heavy as stone, he agreed. A date was set. Word spread quickly. Students whispered of it in dining halls, professors muttered behind newspapers. Some were eager for spectacle, others curious, and many skeptical. A child standing before the most prestigious minds in America. What else could it be but theater? Miguel was told only the night before. He came home late, his hands still raw from scrubbing stairwells, and found Adler waiting in the dim apartment. The professor explained, voice low, that Samuel would face a test. Miguel's face paled. "He is only a boy," Miguel said, his voice cracking. "He has suffered enough already. Must he be paraded before them like an animal?" Adler's eyes softened. "I would not risk it if I did not believe. But understand, sometimes a child must walk into the storm to be seen at all." Miguel sat long in silence, staring at his son curled in sleep. He remembered every cough in the night, every patched shoe, every meal stretched thin. He thought of the laughter Samuel endured, the cruel words of strangers. At last he whispered, "Then I will stand beside him, no matter what they do." The hall chosen was not small. It could seat 100, and that day it was filled nearly to the brim. Faculty sat stiff in their chairs, students leaned forward with eager eyes, and Klein himself stood at the side, arms crossed. On the blackboard gleamed a problem drawn from the edge of known mathematics, a question so steep it could humble even the strongest climbers. It was no Olympiad puzzle, but one of those riddles that lived half in myth, a problem about prime numbers and their hidden rhythm, one that had resisted generations. Samuel entered holding his father's hand. His sweater was patched, his shoes damp from melted snow. The murmur of voices quieted into an uneasy hush. He felt the weight of every eye pressing down. For a moment, his courage faltered. He wanted to turn and flee, but then he remembered the brittle notebook Adler had shown him, the handwriting of Ramanujan, called nonsense once, now treasured as gold. He remembered Ethan kneeling to tell him never to lose the quiet inside. And he remembered his father's tired hands, red from cleaning floors, so he might one day walk freely. Samuel let go of Miguel's hand and stepped forward. The chalk was cold in his fingers. His writing began, shaky at first, uneven letters scratching across the dark board. But then, the music returned. He sketched circles, patterns, constellations of numbers. He wrote, not as a scholar but as a dreamer, drawing maps of possibility. Murmurs rose, some mocking, some startled. Klein smirked. "Childish drawings," he muttered. But Adler leaned forward, his heart racing. He saw connections unfolding. Primitive, yes, but daring. Samuel was not solving in the strict sense. He was showing a pathway, a geometry of primes no textbook had dared. Minutes stretched into an hour. The boy's face grew flushed, his hair damp with sweat. Finally, he dropped the chalk, exhausted. What remained on the board was not a solution, not complete, but a vision, something between mathematics and poetry, enough to shake the certainty of those who thought him a fraud. Silence followed. For a long breath, no one spoke. Then, from the back, Ethan rose. His voice, clear and steady, filled the hall. "I have studied this problem for years. I could not see what he has shown in one afternoon. If you cannot recognize the gift before you, then perhaps you do not deserve it." The hall stirred. Some clapped timidly, others frowned. Klein's face tightened in anger, but the seed of doubt had been planted in his dominion. Samuel stood trembling, unsure whether he had failed or triumphed. Miguel rushed forward, wrapping his arms around his son. "You were brave," he whispered into the boy's hair. "That is enough. Whatever they say, it is enough." But Adler, his eyes glistening, touched Miguel's shoulder. "No, it is more than enough. Today he has shown the courage of discovery. And that, my friend, is rarer than genius." When they left the hall, snow had begun to fall again, soft and patient. Samuel looked up, flakes melting on his face. For the first time, he did not feel the sting of ridicule as much as the warmth of something larger, recognition, fragile but real. Yet storms rarely pass so quickly. Klein, humiliated before his peers, would not rest. His envy had sharpened into resolve, and he would strike again, harder, more merciless. Samuel had walked into the storm and survived, but the true tempest was still gathering beyond the horizon, and so the boy and his father walked home through snow, unaware of how much darker the path was about to become. But that night, in the small room with peeling walls, Samuel's heart was calm. For the first time, he believed that maybe the truth, no matter how fragile, was strong enough to endure. The snow melted at last, leaving the cobblestones of Harvard Yard slick with rain. Spring arrived with its pale light, but for Samuel the days grew heavier. After his public trial in the lecture hall, a strange silence followed him. Some students glanced with awe, others with suspicion. Miguel noticed it most when they passed through corridors, whispers that ceased as soon as they entered, eyes that darted away too quickly. The world had seen the boy's gift, but not all were grateful for it. Klein was wounded pride made flesh. To him, Samuel's presence was an insult not only to Harvard, but to his own authority. A 10-year-old, son of a janitor, daring to draw visions of primes before his colleagues, it had unsettled the order he cherished. And so Klein began his quiet campaign. He spoke in corners, sowing doubt. "Adler has lost his rigor," he whispered to other professors. "The boy is a curiosity at best, a distraction at worst. Our classrooms are not circuses." He spread rumors that Adler had staged the performance, guiding Samuel's hand, inventing the illusion of genius for his own vanity. Students picked up the tone. Some mocked Samuel openly, scribbling crude drawings of circles and stars on the margins of their notes. Others tested him cruelly, thrusting pages of unsolved problems into his hands, then laughing when his answers were incomplete. Even Ethan, loyal though he was, could not silence them all. At home, Miguel saw the toll. Samuel no longer rushed to his scraps of paper with the same joy. He still worked, still scribbled long into the night, but shadows lingered beneath his eyes. One evening, as the boy sat staring at a half-written page, Miguel knelt beside him. "Samuel," he said softly, "you do not need to prove yourself to them. Your worth is not measured by their eyes." The boy's reply was almost a whisper. "But Papa, if I stop, they will say Klein was right." "They will say I am nothing." Miguel's hands, calloused from years of scrubbing, cupped his son's face. "You are my everything. That is enough." But he knew his words could not soothe the ache that genius carried. The ache of being doubted, mocked, feared. One day, Klein struck openly. He arranged a seminar, inviting students and faculty alike, and at the end, he summoned Samuel forward. It was framed as an opportunity, but Miguel saw the cruelty in his eyes. Klein placed on the board a problem famous for its trap, an equation that looked solvable, but collapsed into contradiction, one that could swallow hours before revealing itself as impossible. "Show us, child," Klein said, his voice silky with disdain. "Show us your miracle." Samuel hesitated. The chalk trembled in his fingers. He began to work, writing carefully, each step like stepping into quicksand. The audience watched, some with smirks, others with pity. Miguel clenched his fists, praying silently. Minutes passed, stretching into an hour. At last, Samuel's writing faltered. He stared at the board, realization dawning that the puzzle could not be solved. His shoulders slumped. Klein's smile was sharp as glass. "Enough," he declared. "Genius, you see, cannot be built on childish drawings. This is Harvard, not a playground." Laughter broke from the crowd, cruel and cutting. Miguel rushed forward, pulling Samuel close. He wanted to shout, to strike, but he held his tongue, for he knew a janitor's anger would only bring humiliation upon his son. Adler, pale with fury, rose and spoke. This was not a test, it was a trick. To mock a child is not scholarship, it is cowardice. But Klein only shrugged, basking in the approval of those who nodded along. The damage was done. Samuel buried his face in his father's coat, silent tears soaking the fabric. That night was the darkest yet. Back in their narrow room, Samuel sat in the corner, knees drawn to his chest. He would not eat, would not speak. Miguel sat across from him, heart breaking. Finally, in the quiet, the boy whispered, "Papa, maybe I should stop. Maybe I should put the chalk away." The words struck Miguel like a blade. He rose, knelt, and took his son's small hands. "Samuel, listen to me. There will always be men who try to silence what they do not understand. But if you stop now, their cruelty wins. And if you keep going, you carry not only your dream, but mine, and every dream I had to bury. Do you hear me? You are not alone." Tears blurred Samuel's vision, but he nodded faintly. Something in his father's voice, raw with love and sacrifice, pierced the fog of shame. He reached for the chalk again, slowly, like a wounded soldier lifting his weapon. Days passed, and though the laughter echoed, Samuel returned to his scraps of paper. Adler, shaken but resolute, came often to guide him. Ethan visited too, offering encouragement, though guilt weighed on him for not stopping the cruelty sooner. The small room in Somerville became once again a sanctuary of quiet numbers, though now tinged with sorrow. Yet within Samuel, something shifted. He began to see that mathematics was not just beauty, but also armor. Each proof he attempted, each idea he sketched, was no longer just for himself. It was defiance, a refusal to let Klein's laughter define him. One evening, as rain tapped against the window, Miguel watched his son bent over a notebook, his face lit by lamplight. The boy was thinner, wearier, yet his eyes burned steady. Miguel whispered to himself, "He will endure. He must." For in that fragile room, amidst poverty and betrayal, Samuel's true strength was being forged, not in triumphs, but in wounds. And far above in the ivory tower where envy whispered, Klein prepared his next move, unaware that every cruelty he dealt was shaping the very greatness he sought to destroy. Spring deepened in Cambridge, the river thawing, blossoms trembling on the edges of the yard. But for Samuel, the season carried no warmth. The echoes of laughter in Klein's lecture hall still haunted him, the cruel reminder that to many he would always be the janitor's boy, an interloper in borrowed halls. He kept writing each night, chalk scratching onto scraps of paper, yet often he stopped midway, staring at the marks as if doubting they were his. Miguel watched with quiet anguish. His son had endured more than any child should, and yet the fire had not fully dimmed. It flickered still, waiting for air. But Miguel could not provide it. His world was mops, buckets, and weary silence. He prayed, not to be rescued himself, but for someone, somewhere, to see his boy. One evening, as Adler left the building, He found Samuel lingering outside, staring at the statue of John Harvard as if it held an answer. The professor's heart ached. He had fought colleagues, endured whispers, but even his defense could not erase the boy's wounds. That night, Adler made a decision. He wrote letters, not to faculty, not to skeptics like Klein, but to old friends beyond the narrow circle of Harvard. One was to a professor at MIT who studied the deep structures of number theory. Another to a physicist at Princeton who had once been a refugee child himself. He wrote not of spectacle, but of a fragile mind that needed shelter. "There is a boy," Adler wrote, 10 years old, son of a janitor. His methods are crude, his handwriting uneven. But in his vision lives a spark I have seen only once before, long ago, in the work of Ramanujan. I ask not for applause, but for protection. The world is too quick to crush such flowers before they bloom. Weeks later, answers arrived. One by one, scholars came quietly, curious but discreet. They did not arrive with trumpets or lectures, but with patience. A man from MIT sat with Samuel in an empty classroom, sliding a sheet across the table. "Try this," he said gently. Samuel bent over the page, eyes narrowing, then began to draw. Within minutes, the visitor leaned back, astonished at the angles the boy pursued. Another evening, the physicist from Princeton came. He asked Samuel not of numbers, but of patterns, how the boy saw shapes in the primes, constellations in the equations. Samuel's eyes lit again as he spoke, hands moving as if arranging stars. The physicist smiled softly, for he recognized the hunger of a mind that saw beauty where others saw walls. Miguel, standing at the edge of each room, felt his heart swell. For the first time, men who had walked through gates closed to him were kneeling to listen to his son. Their kindness was cautious, but real. Word spread quietly, this time not as ridicule, but as rumor of wonder. A handful of graduate students, brave enough to ignore Klein's shadow, began slipping Samuel books, leaving them wrapped in brown paper outside the janitor's closet. A geometry text, a number theory compendium, even a battered volume of Hardy and Wright's great treatise. Samuel devoured them like bread after famine. His notes grew denser, his sketches sharper. The wounds of humiliation still ached, but the boy was healing through knowledge itself. Ethan, steadfast though weighed by guilt, came often to the apartment. He brought Samuel a slate so he would no longer have to scribble only on scraps. The first time Samuel wrote upon it, chalk dust rising in their dim room, Miguel wept silently. To him, it was as if his son had been given not just a tool, but recognition that he was no longer invisible. But even kindness brings new burdens. Samuel began to feel the pull of expectation, a sense that he must always astonish, always prove worthy of the rare faith others placed in him. He worked late, his small frame hunched over equations, until Miguel had to lift the slate from his hands and whisper, "Enough, my son. Even stars must rest." Still, amid the strain, hope returned. One night, as rain tapped against the thin window, Samuel turned to his father and said softly, "Papa, maybe they are wrong. Maybe I do belong here, even if they cannot see it yet." Miguel pulled him close, his eyes shining. "You belong wherever truth is, Samuel. And the truth has never feared where it comes from. Yet storms never vanish fully." Klein watched from the shadows, his pride still festering. He heard of the visitors, the whispers of wonder returning. Each kindness given to the boy was, to him, another insult. He began gathering allies, men who feared disruption more than discovery. If Samuel's star rose higher, it would expose their complacency. Klein resolved to snuff it out before the world saw it clearly. But for the moment, in that fragile spring, Samuel lived in a circle of quiet hands that reached out to him. For the first time since the humiliation, he felt not only the ache of being mocked, but the warmth of being believed in. And though he could not yet see the battles to come, the boy who once thought of giving up now carried in his chest a stubborn flame. The knowledge that somewhere beyond the shadows, there were those who heard his music and whispered back, "Play on." And so, in a small room smelling of soap and damp walls, the janitor's son lifted his chalk again, this time not in defiance, but in hope. The child of silent hallways was no longer alone. Summer pressed heavy on Cambridge, the air thick with heat that clung to walls and skin alike. Tourists wandered the yard, snapping pictures of ivy and brick, never knowing how many stories were buried inside. For Samuel, those halls had grown cold long before the season turned. He no longer lingered in doorways, no longer dared to glance at the blackboards through half-open doors. The laughter from Klein's cruel seminar still rang in his ears, and the shame of being paraded like a circus act had burned itself into his chest. Yet Adler still believed. He brought Samuel into side rooms, into corners of the library, into hours when most of Harvard slept. There the boy's spark returned in flashes, like fireflies on a summer night, brief, beautiful, impossible to ignore. Adler urged patience, whispered encouragement, but each moment of hope drew more eyes, and Klein's shadow lengthened. Klein had been waiting. His pride, cut by the sight of a child commanding a hall, had festered into fury. He began to write letters of his own, not of admiration as Adler had done, but of warning. He spoke of liability, of child labor laws, of dangerous precedent. He painted Adler as reckless, Miguel as opportunistic, and Samuel as a distraction that threatened the sanctity of Harvard's reputation. Committees were formed, as they always are when fear dresses itself in authority. They did not speak to Samuel. They did not ask Miguel. They did not weigh the boy's fragile courage. They weighed only risk, reputation, and precedent. One voice after another nodded in agreement. The decision came stamped, sealed, inevitable. The letter was brief, couched in courtesy, but the meaning was hard as stone. The child of a janitor was no longer to be permitted in lecture halls, libraries, or classrooms. All work must cease. Any future contact would be considered a breach of policy. The words "in the interest of the institution" sat like iron bars across the page. Miguel received the envelope while sweeping a stairwell. He opened it under the dim light of the hall, his heart sinking with each line. He did not show it to Samuel at first. That night he sat by the window long after his son slept, the letter trembling in his hands. He had known poverty, ridicule, endless labor. But this was different. This was the theft of a future. In the morning, Samuel found the letter folded on the table. He read it slowly, lips moving over each word. When he reached the end, he looked up at his father with wide, wet eyes. "Papa," he whispered, "they don't want me anymore." Miguel dropped to his knees and held him tight. "It is not you they do not want. It is me. It is us. It is the truth they fear." But Samuel shook his head, sobs breaking through. "I tried so hard," he cried. "I did everything right. Why is it not enough?" Ethan came that afternoon breathless, clutching a copy of the letter he had seen through other hands. He cursed the decision, begged Adler to fight, even considered leading students in protest. But protests are loud and short-lived, and institutions are stone. Adler himself was warned. Any further defiance would cost him his chair. His eyes were tired when he visited Miguel's apartment, yet they burned with guilt. "I am sorry," Adler said, voice hoarse. "I could not stop them." Miguel placed a hand on the professor's arm. "You tried," he said softly. "That is more than most." Samuel sat silent in the corner, the slate on his knees untouched. He stared out the window where children played in the street, their laughter sharp with freedom he no longer felt. The days that followed were hollow. Miguel continued his janitorial work, but Harvard's halls had become prisons of memory. Where once Samuel had felt music in the chalk, now he felt only echoes. He stopped carrying scraps of paper in his pocket. He stopped asking questions at dinner. At night, Miguel sometimes heard him weeping quietly, stifling the sound so his father might sleep. One evening, unable to bear it, Miguel walked with his son to the yard one last time. They stood outside the great gates, the brick glowing in the setting sun. Students hurried past with books under their arms, laughing, debating, alive with promise. Samuel pressed his face to the iron bars as if they were a window. "Papa," he whispered, "was it all a dream?" Miguel swallowed hard. "No, my son. It was real. Too real for them to allow." He lifted Samuel into his arms, though the boy had grown heavy. "Listen to me." They closed a door. But the world is larger than these walls. Numbers do not belong to Harvard. They belong to you. Samuel rested his head against his father's shoulder. His tears fell hot against Miguel's shirt, but the man carried him home as he had when he was a baby, step by steady step through the twilight. That night, in their small room, Samuel finally lifted his slate again. His hand shook as he wrote, the lines uneven, the proof unfinished. But when Miguel saw it, his chest filled with quiet relief. For in that trembling chalk lay defiance. The storm had struck, the door had closed, but the boy was still reaching. Somewhere in the silence, embers glowed, waiting for breath. The fall came quietly. Not thunder, not flame, but the slow dimming of a lamp. One notice became two, then three. A rumor about safety, a complaint about protocol, whispers that a professor had exploited a child for attention. By the time the letters were signed, the doors were already closed. Miguel was dismissed with courtesy and a handshake that avoided his eyes. Samuel was not banned outright, the letter said, only discouraged from entering academic spaces without permission. But discouragement wears the same coat as exclusion. The blackboard stayed clean. For a week, Miguel hid the truth, walking farther each day to temporary jobs. But children feel silence the way they feel cold. Samuel asked, very softly, "Papa, what did they take from us?" "Only a key," Miguel said. "They cannot take numbers from your head." They moved to a cheaper town north of the city. The apartment was small, the radiator hissed, and the view was an alley with a maple tree that fought for sun. Miguel washed dishes, unloaded crates, swept offices at night. He came home smelling of soap and metal, a smile fastened to his face. Samuel found refuge in a public library. The math shelves were thin, but to him they were treasure. A geometry book with lantern-like diagrams, a number theory text worn soft by years, a paperback about patterns. He read them as though each page was a letter addressed only to him. For the first time, he began writing like a mathematician. Definitions, steps, small lemmas stitched together. Rigor, love in work clothes, as he would later call it. The librarian noticed his slate and quietly left him a box of chalk. "For your work," she said. "Every lighthouse needs oil." At night, Miguel asked for stories. Samuel tried to explain without symbols, numbers in cycles like days of the week, symmetry as kindness, prime numbers as lonely towers that still built a skyline. Miguel nodded as though he could see the city rising. News still found them. Adler, restricted but loyal, mailed small problems disguised as puzzles. A physicist who had once been a refugee sent a thin book with the note, "When lost, go slower." Ethan came with petitions and guilt, speaking of truth in the only language students know, passion. One evening in a church basement where Miguel studied English, Samuel sat at a corner table, brushing chalk dust from his slate. A silver-haired teacher named Mrs. Whitaker glanced over. "I used to teach math," she smiled. "Mind if I see?" She read the crooked lines, frowned with concentration, then tapped gently. "This is beautiful. But beauty must stand on its feet. Show me why it must be true." Week by week she returned, teaching him to lay proofs like a table. Name every plate, seat every guest, no surprises halfway through. She slowed him down, insisting each stone be stepped on before leaping to the next. Slowly, Samuel's ideas grew straighter, his bridges sturdier. Then came a letter from Adler, smuggled through Mrs. Whitaker. No apology, no confession, but one crucial line. The department recognizes the unique educational needs of a minor showing promise and will permit supervised access to resources off the main lecture schedule. It was not a welcome. It was a crack. That Saturday, father and son rode a bus before dawn, Slate wrapped in a towel, a thermos of orange tea between them. They met Adler in a side room no tourist photographed. Miguel shook his hand like sealing a pact. For 2 hours, Samuel worked, not to dazzle, but to move carefully, stone by stone, learning at last that rigor could sound like music, too. When they left, the river shone in the sun, and on the bus home, Samuel slept on his father's shoulder. Miguel watched the streets roll past and felt for the first time in months that tomorrow might be better. The world had not repented. Klein still polished his knives of policy. The radiator still hissed. The maple still fought for light. But in Samuel, the embers glowed, no longer fragile, protected now by the circle of kindness. Adler, Ethan, the librarian, the physicist, Mrs. Whitaker, and a father who refused despair. Genius does not survive on applause. It lives on ordinary kindness, on the patience to go slower when the path is steep. And so the child of silent hallways, once exiled, now carried his own lamp. Not yet ablaze, but enough to keep the room warm. Autumn returned to New England, brushing the trees with copper and flame. The air sharpened, the river thickened with fog, and in the alleys of their small town the maple outside Samuel's window burned with sudden color, as if reminding them that beauty can survive neglect. Samuel had grown since the storm of exclusion. He was still thin, still shy, but his steps carried a weight that had not been there before. Each evening he filled his proof diary, pages marked not with triumphs but with steady progress, each mistake catalogued like a rung in a ladder he was building himself. Where once he scribbled visions of stars and circles, now he forged bridges that could bear their own weight. Mrs. Whitaker watched proudly. Adler guided quietly, and Miguel, bone-tired from long shifts, listened to his son explain symmetry and primes as if they were lullabies. But whispers carried even into their refuge. A local journalist, having heard of the janitor's boy prodigy, arrived at the library one Saturday. He asked questions with the curiosity of someone half-believing, half-seeking a spectacle. Miguel hesitated, but Samuel answered simply, his voice soft, "Numbers are my friends. I don't care if anyone laughs." The article was small, buried in the back of the Sunday paper, yet it spread beyond their town. Letters began to arrive, one from a retired teacher in Vermont, another from a farmer in Kansas who had once loved math but never had a chance to study. They sent encouragement, advice, even used books wrapped in brown paper. For the first time, Samuel felt what it meant to be carried not by a single institution, but by ordinary people. His exile had made him invisible to Harvard, but visible to the world outside its gates. One morning, Adler brought news that shook Miguel to his core. An international conference on mathematics would be hosted in Boston. Scholars from across the globe would gather. "They will not invite you," Adler said softly to the boy. "But perhaps you might go quietly. Not to speak, only to listen. Sometimes the act of standing in the room is itself a kind of victory." Miguel hesitated. He feared ridicule, feared the cruelty of eyes that had once crushed his son, but Samuel's gaze was steady. "Papa," he whispered, "I want to hear how the world sings." So, on a gray November morning, father and son boarded a bus with seats cracked from years of use. Miguel carried sandwiches wrapped in newspaper. Samuel held his slate like a violin. When they arrived, the hotel lobby buzzed with voices and accents from far away. Equations scrawled on notepads, conversations sparking in corners. To Samuel, it was like entering a cathedral. They stayed on the margins, unnoticed. But one lecture, on prime numbers and hidden patterns, drew Samuel forward. The speaker, a young mathematician from India, presented diagrams on a large screen. Samuel's eyes widened. The constellations he had once drawn in childish chalk now appeared refined, rigorous, dressed in professional language. He tugged at Miguel's sleeve, whispering with awe, "Papa, it's the same song. They are hearing it too." Miguel's throat tightened. For years he had feared his son's visions were dreams too fragile for the world. But here, in a room filled with the finest minds, those same dreams lived. Samuel's exile had not been madness. It had been early music, waiting for accompaniment. At the end of the talk, Samuel hesitated, then approached the speaker shyly. His slate clutched in both hands, he showed the man his diagrams. The mathematician bent down, studied them, and after a long pause, smiled. "You see in 10 years what took me 20 to see. Do not stop, little one. The world is wide, and it needs your eyes." Miguel nearly wept, not because his son had been praised, but because for the first time the words came not from defenders, not from those forced to protect him, but from a stranger who owed him nothing. On the bus ride home, Samuel fell asleep against his father's arm, slate balanced on his knees. Miguel looked out at the darkening skyline and felt something shift inside. Exile had not destroyed his boy. It had tempered him. Cruelty had pressed him into shape, but kindness had lit him again. And now, somewhere beyond the horizon, a new door waited. That winter, Samuel began to speak of his dreams, not of Harvard, not of blackboards filled with applause, but of a return to the town where his father was born, to the small community that had no teachers left, where children left school early to work the fields. "Papa," he said, "someday I will go back. I will build a room with a blackboard, and I will fill it with chalk dust. And no child will ever feel like I did, that learning is a door locked by someone else's key." Miguel's eyes filled with tears. For all his son's genius, it was this vow that revealed his greatness. The child of silent hallways was no longer silent. His voice, though soft, carried a promise larger than any lecture hall, that the gift of knowledge is not for the few, but for the many, and that even in ashes, embers wait for breath. And so the winter passed, with father and son warmed not by fire in a stove, but by the light of something stronger. Hope returned, fragile yet unbreakable. Winter came again, clear and sharp. A year had passed since Harvard's doors had closed, and then opened a crack. Samuel no longer chased applause. He built proofs slowly, each step like laying a stone across a river. Miguel measured days not by wages, but by the widening light in his son's eyes. Then a letter arrived. Not from Klein, but from a new committee. No apology, only an invitation. A Saturday program for local schools, asking if Samuel might share how he thinks. Miguel asked, "Do you want this?" Samuel touched the window where the maple tree stood bare and said, "Yes, because it is a room." On the morning of the event, they carried a slate wrapped in a towel and a thermos of tea. The hall was small, filled with children and teachers. At the back sat Ethan, Adler, Mrs. Whitaker, even the librarian. Klein did not come. Samuel wrote on the blackboard in plain letters, "How to hear a problem." He told the children that puzzles sound like noise at first, then rhythm, then music if you are patient. He laid each step slowly, proof by proof, until the solution stood on its feet. No performance, only clarity. Questions rose. What if you get stuck? Samuel answered, "I keep a diary of mistakes and stand on them." What if you are afraid? Fear means you are near something worth your courage. The room grew quiet in the way a field grows still when the wind changes. Teachers nodded. Children leaned forward. For once, the boy who had been mocked as janitor's kid was not spectacle but neighbor, sharing a light that belonged to everyone. Afterward, teachers asked him to return. The paper they gave Miguel was not a contract, only a schedule, community sessions, small stipends, Saturdays reserved. Yet to Miguel it felt heavier than gold. Months later, father and son returned to Miguel's hometown, to a school with cracked walls and no chalkboard. Together they built one, painting a sheet of masonite, sanding it smooth, mounting it on the wall of a classroom whose clock ticked unevenly. Mrs. Whitaker sent chalk, the librarian a wooden ledge, Ethan notebooks, Adler a short note, for the room. On the first night, 6 children came, then 12. Samuel did not lecture. He asked their fears, waited, then laid one small lemma, one plank, inviting them across. When a proof wobbled, the room breathed together until it held. No child was mocked, each left with white dust on their fingers, as if carrying fire. Miguel cleaned after each session, humming, the keys at his belt jingling like bells. He saw his life in the blackboard, erased and written again, scarred yet faithful. Word spread. Farmers brought apples, a grandmother sent a note, "You have warmed this house." Even the young mathematician from Boston visited, listening as a child explained primes as repeating days. He smiled and said, "It is a beautiful room." Harvard's halls remained, but their power dimmed. Klein retired with speeches and a clock, unrepentant. Yet his shadow no longer mattered. Samuel had built his own door. On a June evening, Miguel locked the school after class. Samuel, taller now, stood beside him. "You did it," Miguel said. "We did it," Samuel answered. "What will you call this place?" Samuel looked at the board, faint traces of chalk still glimmering. He smiled. "The room that listens." And so it was. A janitor's son taught and learned, always both, always grateful. The old pain became part of the music. And in that music, children found courage, fathers found rest, and a promise became true. No child would ever feel a door locked by someone else's key. The chalk dust settled. The room, patient as a heart, waited for the next question. And somewhere far from Harvard's gates, the light returned, not as a blaze to blind, but as a hearth to gather around. Steady, generous, enough. Thank you for listening. If the janitor's child could find light in silent hallways, then each of us can carry a small flame into the world. Thank you.